All right. I'm supposed to say got it. As a matter of personal privilege, many of you may not know my wife, Kathy Whitmire, and I'm pleased that she's joining us tonight as well. So it's always helpful to have somebody holding you when you make a presentation, and she will be, I'm sure, helping me with how I could improve or what I did right. So thank you. So it's good to be with you. The introduction that I was going to ask, and I only want to do it very briefly, but before we were talking, Mary Margaret said that she had one of her relatives who just served 2 years and he's out now. How many of the rest of you, just a show of hands, have family members, friends, or have done prison visitation at some point, or yourself have been incarcerated? I'm just interested how many of us. So yeah, that's a pretty good number of folks that have been already involved in some way directly with with the prison system, the criminal justice system. I'm going to talk tonight not just about restorative justice, but I want to put a context in the whole system, for the whole system, with the hope that within a context we can better establish goals, or what we personally, each of you may or may not have commitments to continue with this work, but for those who do, I want you to have some sense of the context. And then I want to be able at the end to give you some examples of how you might continue to be somehow involved in our criminal justice reform, primarily in Washington State, but there's plenty to do nationally, of course, as well. So, how would each of you define crime? What's your idea? What's crime? What is a crime? Anybody want to volunteer a try at what a crime is? What's a crime? That's a Bruce. Yeah. You need. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. Well, I would be somewhat embarrassed, having gone to law school, to not be able to answer that question, at least make a stab at it. So the challenge has been thrown down. It would be a violation of the criminal law. Well, then that begs the question, well, what is the criminal law? And the criminal law is whatever the government of any particular country deems it to be.
Yep.
That may be moral or not so moral. Deep South and apartheid being examples of immoral but sanctioned criminal laws that were not so good. Anyway, but let's hear from others, or have you share the context.
What Bruce is giving us is the formal definition. A crime in the legal system is defined as you have to break a law to be criminal. You can do a lot of bad things, but if you don't break a law, you can get away with it without being accused, or at least legally accused. Anybody else want to try with a definition of a crime?
Of course, you can get away with crime even if it's against the law, depending on who you are. Being in the anti-torture movement for all these years, torture would be prime example number one. And then on a whole different level, we talk about what, from a moral perspective, the crime, right? Whether it has legal status as a crime or is punished as a crime or not. So, I would add that.
Well, combining both what Bruce said and what Rob said, I take it at a very simple perspective, which leads me into the restorative justice model, which is any harm to a person, the community, or to self, for me, is a crime. I'm more interested in what harm is done than the legal definition, but that's me shifting the argument. So we'll get back to that in a little bit, but that it's important to have a sense of what we're talking about here. And then the next question that I would ask if we were in a nice circle is what do you do when somebody does harm you, when somebody commits something against you, steals your car, assaults you, slanders you in public, harms your spouse or your child? What's your response to that? I mean, what's your range of responses? I mean, I'm not trying to trap you here with the right answer. Well, maybe I should just go ahead because it does sound a little like a trap. But one of the obvious things is I want vengeance. I want to grab that guy and wring his neck. I want to punch him out. I want to make him pay for what he did to me, my child, and the grief that he has caused me. That's vengeance. And that's a very understandable response. And then there are lesser responses like you want to just turn it over to the authorities, let them take care of it. My response is, okay, take him away, get rid of him. I don't care to ever think about it again. I'm done. And then you might soften it a bit more and say, well, I'd really like to know what was on that person's mind to do what they did to me, how much harm they did, what was going on, who is this person? And then you might even go so far, and this again blends in, you'll see the restorative justice blending throughout here, which you might ask, what was going on with that person? And is there some way that he or she can be treated or healed so that terrible thing that happened to me will never happen again to anyone else? And that is a really heartfelt question that in terms of bringing on justice, that is the direction that I would like us to go. So that's kind of the preliminaries of what I wanted to, when I talk about it. You can forget the rest, but those are the two things I want you to understand is where we want to go if we're going to really do a moral and systemic change. So just I think it's always interesting for a little better understanding of context. You may not know that the context for our criminal justice system, the European context anyway, goes back to the Romans and the Greeks. They had this vast territory to cover, and they didn't want to have this tribe and that tribe do different things, eye for eye kind of thing. They put they codified what was criminal and how you treated it, which was seen in some ways as an improvement. They, of course, were still cruel as they could possibly be. The crucifixion of Jesus and the stories of rows of these people crucified because they were dared to challenge the Roman Empire. It was a very cruel system. The European system, then the English, began to say, well, at least we're going to give these people a chance to defend themselves. How about trials? So you get an opportunity to be accused, but also to say there were circumstances before a judge or eventually even before some peers to judge how serious it was or what your motives were or how much penalty or punishment you might get. But that softened it some. We got to the American model, and it's still had a long way to go. The Puritans came out with a system that was based on their idea of what's the word I want now? This is why of what is it? That you're already in or out. What's that word? But they felt that an individual was either chosen or not, and if you weren't chosen, then you were disposable. And so that really began the process of who's in and out, as opposed to something you might wish for, which is that you would bring that person back into community. So the punishment end of things was still very severe. And if you were found to be guilty, you ended up in a great big hall or a room or a pit of a prison. Some of you have seen these in museums. Everybody thrown in there together with some food and maybe a can to pee in. But you were held there and you're isolated, miserable. So the Quakers had this great idea. They thought, wouldn't it be sweet if we took these people and gave them a decent place to stay? So major movement, major organization, and they built in 1820 something a beautiful building that had 7 wings to it, and everybody got their own place to live, their own cell, their own solitary room to be in, where they were expected to take the opportunity to be penitent and change their ways and come out of that experience a changed person. Hence the word penitentiary, which is still the word that comes down. The Quakers found quickly, of course, that it drove people nuts, that they abandoned the whole thing. Unfortunately, that concept of locking people up in a cage and whether or not they're given a chance to repent or to become penitent is beside the point at this sense. But we still feel that it's okay to put somebody in a cage, particularly by themselves, and leave them there for, in the case of somebody in the Washington state system, 27 years solitary. And amazingly still articulate. He was on the other day on a hearing that we did. But anyway, that's kind of the story of the early years of American history. And then it really gets gruesome because at the point of emancipation and the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments that freed the slaves, suddenly the response, the pushback to the freedom of the slaves was to create a system of felonies, all kinds of felonies, trespassing or whatever. But as soon as you had a felony conviction of any sort, you were put in a whole different category. You were sent back to the fields, which helped keep the slave system going. But your rights were taken away. You couldn't vote. And basically you were put in slavery once again. And that system of associating felony convictions with the loss of civil rights, of votes, persists today in the state of Washington. I mean, this is not ancient history. The state of Washington still says that if you're incarcerated, or until last year, even if you were out, you can no longer vote. And that simply came down through the Reconstruction years, all the way down to the 21st century. So that's the legacy of that era, and it's racist to the core. I mean, that's what it was all about. So then that continued through Jim Crow, when the government came up with the idea that you could accuse somebody of a felony, particularly crack cocaine. The drug laws were used for what was called the Southern movement, the Southern strategy of disenfranchising not just black guys, young black guys, but whole communities now, whole neighborhoods that no longer could vote, no longer could get an education from the government, no longer could get housing. It was a grand and very successful scheme of controlling the vote. And we're, of course, seeing that being revised now in our voter restriction laws that are being run through the different states. So all this history goes back to criminal felony convictions idea. This is so at the heart of racism. And one of the reasons that I think my work and our work in criminal justice reform is because at some level, it is the possibility that we can pay back, or we can change things. We can repair the harm that we did with African Americans by making sure that this system of racist criminal justice gets confronted, gets reckoned with. So that's kind of where that's kind of a brief overall history. But now there's some good things that came out of all this. One is that some of you know this book, and I hope all of you at least are aware of it. It's called The New Jim Crow. It was written in 2010 by Michelle Alexander. And for the first time, I don't know, it's first time, but it was the beginning of public awareness of this systemic, discriminatory, racist criminal justice system in this country. She goes into great detail about how it all worked. And she became a very popular speaker all over the country. She was going to universities. She was going to public. I went to an assembly someplace, the place was packed. People were beginning to see the criminal justice system for what it was. It was racist, discriminatory, and simply unjust. So thanks to Rachel Alexander, and there are other writers. If there are two books I'd recommend if you haven't delved into criminal justice at all. The other one is a more hopeful book. It's almost a little novel, but Just Mercies by Brian Stevenson, a young lawyer. There's a movie on it now too, coming out of Harvard, going back down south, taking on a capital case, a murder case, unjustly tried. And he gained notoriety in this country for that book and for his work. And now he's a major proponent of a lot of the criminal justice reform and awareness of the racism that's behind it. So Brian Stevenson. And then the other area that I want to now shift into is the hopeful signs of a commitment to restorative justice work. And the book that I recommend, it's a little heavier, it's more academic, but Until We Reckon by Danielle Sarad makes the case that even in a capital crime, even in a murder case, it is possible to do healing, to do restorative work between a victim of the crime and their family, in this case, murder, and the offender, the person who committed the crime. It's an amazing story. And she makes the case very firmly that this is the way to go. This is the reform movement. It's towards restorative work. We can't keep locking people up. We can't keep ruining people's lives. And we can't keep bringing victims of crimes back into the courtroom every time there's a hearing, every time there's a parole hearing, every time there's to have them revisit the trauma that was so difficult for them in the first place. It's a very positive approach. But I want to talk now more about what's going on in Washington, because I think that's what you mostly want to hear and talk about and respond to. What I'm most encouraged by is that after years of failure to pull together any kind of a coalition, any kind of a movement to address the dysfunctional, in some ways, dysfunctional system of criminal justice in this state. We now have a number of coalitions working. The history of our state was that somewhere in the 1980s, and I only heard this secondhand, but the story is that a mother had her daughter cruelly murdered. I mean, one of these horrible crimes, or these horrible murders. And her response to that was to run for the legislature. And while a legislator, she, of course, could really turn on the tears and turn on the empathy and get everybody to agree that these kinds of people should not ever be allowed to be out in public. They should be locked up for as long as we can lock them up. So lengthen the sentences, keep them there forever. 3 strikes, the business that the third time you get a felony conviction, you're in for life. Prevailed for a lot of the 1980s in this state. And once you can get legislation through, as bad as it may be, it's hard to undo it. And so a lot of what has been going on in the last 20 years has been to try to say, wait a minute, we're better than that. Washington's better than that. When you rank the states in criminal justice, we're hardly at the middle in terms of a lot of the issues that are of deep concern in progressive criminal justice reform. So what has happened is that, well, when I first got here in 2006, we tried to put together a coalition. We had a big meeting down at the Methodist Church in Seattle. We had 30, 40 people there from all over the place in the room, and we got nowhere. They ended up being just a big argument of who had the inside, who could do this, who could do that. And finally, one of the aides to one of the senators who had attended that, representing sort of the legislative perspective, said, you folks are never going to get anywhere in the legislature. Unless you have a united voice, unless you're united in some way, focused and centered, you're never going to get any serious attention from the legislature. There's too many other things going on. It's a done case. You're never going to get anywhere. She basically walked out of that meeting, leaving us feeling very bereft. That was a number of years ago. This is Dan Clark had put that meeting together for the Quakers who know Dan, and it was devastating, and nothing happened then from 2000. This was 7 through the last until the 15, 16, and then something began to really perk. I was involved in a bill that Dan had started, which he found to be touted as the single bill that you could do in any state legislature that would be the most crucial one that you could pass. And that bill was to establish an independent ombuds program within the state. That is a citizen-based, or at least an independent from the DOC recourse for families and people within the system who are being mistreated, abused in so many ways. So it took us 10 years from 2006 to 2000, no, I guess it was maybe 2008 to 18. We finally passed it in 2018. We have an ombuds program in place. We have it staffed. We have a well staffed with several, not only director, but other people. So beginning now to see that we can be successful. And I had the privilege of facilitating that coalition. It was about 15 people, but we were able to gather quite a range of people to support that bill. And we got Roger Goodman, who's always been a pretty good champion for this kind of thing. Some of you may know. But he kept working with us and we got it through. But since then, since 2018, what has happened is that a number of, well, let me just back up just a tad. There have been other coalitions. Our Quaker coalition is called Quaker Voice now. We're 15 years old. We have a very well-organized, staff, successful program of criminal justice reform in the state of Washington. We supported a bill that allowed restorative justice to become an RCW, meaning a law that it was possible for prosecutors to consider a restorative justice approach to a crime. That was a big breakthrough, and that was something that our Quaker Voice organization did. So other coalitions began to form, and what's happening now is that there are about 10 or 12 of these organizations. I sit in on at least 6 of them. They're staffed by younger people, professionally supported by representatives from Columbia Legal Group and with the ACLU. But then they have other people in one group that successfully put together the law last year that allows people to vote when they're no longer under the direct supervision of the Department of Corrections. Those folks, all the leadership, were formerly incarcerated. They introduced themselves as impacted, and that's the code for I was inside. I know what that's like, and that's why I'm committed outside now. And there's quite a strong group. It was even further supported by an amazing woman named Tara Simmons, who is the first person that we know of, at least, who was incarcerated and got out, struggled. She was a nurse, went in on a drug conviction, came out, got a law degree, fought her way through recognition for her status as a lawyer, and ran for the legislature. She's now in the House. And her bill, the bill that I just talked about, the bill to restore voting rights to the formerly incarcerated. Notice I don't say felons now. We dropped that word. We don't like that word because it's stigmatized. But that was a big, now we know we can do this, and we've got champions inside. And we've got these young people, one after another. I keep telling Kathy, I'm just amazed at how well these coalition meetings are run, with everybody listening to one another, with good agenda, with follow through, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that I think is going on now is that nationally, we realize that this tough on crime stuff is not working. And amazingly, we were able to pass a major first step bill. It was called under the Trump administration last year, because the strong conservative wing of the Republican Party had a number of people convicted under Nixon and served several years. Charles Colson is the best known of them. But these guys came out and said, whoa, this is so stupid. These guys are all, half of them are in there on nonviolent crimes, and we're spending how much money per year for them? We can't do that. And he got Colson and got the right wing to pay attention to it. There's a whole organization called Right on Crime with a big red banner that was behind the Trump administration's passage of this first step bill 2 years ago, 3-4 years ago, whatever it's been now. But so there's some movement here to say that we can't keep incarcerating people. You've probably seen some of the statistics on, we incarcerate, I don't know, it's 100. I don't have it right in front of me because I'm sick of the statistic, but it's sickening what our percentage of people that we have incarcerated per 1,000 people versus any other country in the world, including so-called authoritarian countries that don't incarcerate at our rate. It's out of control. We can't continue to do that. So state legislatures, and others are saying, well, we can't afford this now. For the conservatives, it becomes a fiscal issue. And then there's those of us who say that what system we have now is most often inhumane. We go from what is called retributive justice to now what we're providing or what we're promoting is restorative justice. And the definition of retributive is specifically that it is based on punishment. It's punishes. Retributive is to have a path, a moral path of using punishment as a response to crime. And when we do that, we're failing to turn people out of out of the prisons. 70% is the average, or even higher, of people that go right back in because there's been nothing happening. It's not a correctional system. It's a retributive system. It isn't, every time I say it's a correctional system, I have to sort of gasp a little bit because it's not corrective. Corrective would be to have programs there to deal with, as one of the people told me once, if we got them in, we could dry them out, we could get them a GED and give them a plausible skill that they could sell in the public. We wouldn't have these guys in here for more than 3 years. That'd be the max. A year and a half, 2 years could do it if you gave them that kind of a hope, that kind of a base from which to leave prison. But we don't do that. That would be correctional. We put them in there, put them in a cage and poke a stick at them by making it as miserable as we can so often. So during COVID, just bring you up to the time now, COVID has been disaster for the prisons. I mean, you could imagine what it is to administer any kind of an institutional life where people have to share food, have to share space. And in a prison, these are guys that don't want to be in there, first of all. Now they're thrown in with people that may or may not have masks on. The staff now are so scared of getting COVID themselves and dying that it just became chaotic. And I'm impressed that the department still was able to hold some modicum of sanity in the midst of it all. I forgot to mention that one of the things I did in Maine for 3 years was I was an ombudsperson. That is an independent, voluntary person representing, in this case, the religious community. And I went into the prison, in the maximum security prison, once a month for 3 years, or more or less. Some of the times we didn't go in. So I got to go down. I got to sounds like a privilege. I went down to the solitary confinements. I've talked with the guys in solitary a number of times. It's such a miserable, sickening, heart-throbbing experience of going to see men caged up like that in bare places where they've been for sometimes weeks and months. I've sat with the administration and listened to some of the problems they have dealing with sicknesses and mail, how much to censor the mails, how much they have to deal with various groups of people going against one another racially or gang issues. I sat with the guards who tell about what their life is like. I once sat with a bunch of the guards who had a union meeting, because they were all having to do double shifts and were exhausted. And I don't know how I got invited, but I came and sat way in the back. And the people that came to that meeting weren't the guards themselves. They were families. They said, my husband comes home exhausted. He has no time for himself. He's losing it. My son is going in there. He thought it was a thing he could do to help. He got out of the military, and this was a place to go, was to be a guard. And he's miserable. He's dying in there. And he said, and what's more, all the guys inside are walking around with great big muscles, And we're scared for him every single day. When I say goodbye to him, I don't know whether he's going to come home. So I got a chance to see all this, and I sat with the long timers, the guys who are the sort of the counsel for the prisoners, because these are the people that are in there for life. So they're the people that hold the center. And you hear their complaints. It has to do with fairly minor things, like the lights come on at 5:30. Why can't they come on at 6? Why do they turn away our family members when they've driven 2 and 3 hours to the prison and they're 5 minutes late? So a lot of those problems can be addressed administratively, and we watch that happen. The big shots would walk out of the room, the middle administration would stay in the room and sort of give, save face and say, I think we can do that. And changes happened from this Bud's work. And that's why I was so supportive of it when I got to Washington, because we needed this system here. So I don't know, I've gone on for quite a while now, but you get the idea. I'm sure there's more that I have noted here and would like to share, but I think that's enough for, you've been very patient to sit here through, I don't know what, it's been, close to half an hour, 45 minutes here. So that's all I want to say. I'd love to have some questions, some comments, some reactions. And then I want to finish by suggesting some ways that you might consider getting involved at some level with the prison system and with the criminal justice system as a whole. The criminal justice system, of course, includes the judiciary, all the judges, all the prosecutors, which are the big problem, because the prosecutors are elected, they want to be tough on crime. And the whole system of the guards and all the policing, that we didn't even get into policing, which is a huge issue around criminal justice. But that's enough for now. Amen.
So Tom, how do you relate to the prison abolition movement?
Well, I have my own thoughts about that you may not agree to, but I'm not an abolitionist. I am an abolitionist when it comes to torture. I'm an abolitionist when it comes to capital to death penalty. Absolutely. But abolishing prisons, there are people out there that you don't want on the street, at least for a while. There are people who need to be in there. I don't know how many times the guys will say, if somebody wouldn't have arrested me, got me off the street, got me out of drugs, I would have killed myself or somebody else if I didn't already. So there's a place for this. I tout the idea that not abolishment, but to try to rehabilitate or to work towards changing the system as radically as I possibly can. But I think it's a matter of working within the system. For example, we had Paul Bentz, some of you may know, and I met with the new head of the Department of Corrections 3 weeks ago. Her name is Cheryl Strange. She's a nurse. She's a nurse in mental health. She was at Western mental institution. She knows mental health. She knows what a crazy making place a prison is. But we can work with her, and she can do a lot administratively. And that's how I want to go at it. But there are a number of people that say we need to just abolish prisons. We need to do them, get rid of them. They're evil, they're harmful, and to the extent that they're misused, like many other things, it's true. But I want to reform them. I want to say we can do better. We can do what the Europeans do, what the Scandinavians do. They have prisons, but the prisons are humane. The prisons provide for education, provide for personal choices, and they teach people to trust. Trust is the slightest amount of anything in a prison system. Nobody trusts anybody hardly. But in the European systems, the Scandinavian ones especially, there's a whole different model out there. And then I wanted to just say a word about restorative work. The European model said we have a centralized system. You commit the crime, you pay the time, you do the time. The model for the tribes, for the indigenous people in this country, and particularly in Australia, you may know these stories, but they found that they could get better response for people not continuing to commit crimes if they got the community in a circle and grandma sat there and uncle sat there and mom and dad sat there and the people that were offended sat around that circle. And they said, what's up? You're really offending our family pride. You're offending the integrity of our community. We don't trust one another as long as you're out there stealing. Stop it. And that worked. And the people, a famous judge in Canada went up to the Yukon and sat with the tribal people and watched this system. He took off his robe, put on his plaids jacket and sat in a circle, and that was restorative. And that movie, there's movies of this guy's work that are so powerful. So we have those models out there. We don't have to do retributive justice as our sole model. But I don't think we can just say we don't want prisons. I don't think we can just say we don't want police. I think we need to reform both those systems. They can be reformed. There are models that are better. Yeah, Mayor Margaret.
Am I correct that there is now, I'm not sure if it's state or national law that says we no longer will have private detention centers or prisons?
Oh, that's been one of the saddest, god-awful things. Rob, you can pipe in here if you want, but the way we've treated immigrants by naming them as all the bad things we can name them, and then we cage them up, and then we take their children away, and there are movements. I don't know what the latest is. Rob, you might want to mention, but I think we have decided that we no longer will allow that in this state, although we have the big place in Tacoma. I think it's still open, isn't it, Rob? Rob follows the immigrant issues, but that's such a horrible way to treat people. It's what we're looking at now is the way we treated the Japanese after the breakout of World War II. They're just now bringing that up again.
I'll weigh in on the issue of private prisons. There was a Washington law passed to outlaw the private prisons, but it doesn't go into effect until the contract with the geo group that runs the Tacoma facility till their contract runs out, and then it'll go into effect.
Yeah.
So I don't know why they couldn't make it go into effect immediately.
So private prisons and then this federal prison system for the immigrants are there are two different categories, really. The private prisons got the rap that they would contract with the state that they would get so many prisoners in order to be viable economically. And as cruel as that seems, that was what they were allowed to do. So, and of course, when you got in, you no longer had the kind of recourse that people within the state-run prisons would have. These are private now prisons. They can set their own standards of food, standards of incarceration or solitary or whatever they wanted to set up. I hope that we get rid of those. I really do. I think they're awful. Anybody else?
Yes, Tom, are you familiar with what's been going on in King County in the last 5 years or so regarding juvenile justice and there was a long drawn out effort to stop building the new jail and so forth. But it seems like there was maybe some impact from people that were bringing restorative justice to that system.
Yeah. I didn't follow it very closely. I saw it as a building campaign. Am I getting an echo from myself? Yeah, I'm nuts. I'm getting an echo. Anybody know why you get echoes and how can I get rid of it? Okay, it's gone away now. Thank you, Jonathan. I guess I'll give you credit. So any other comments or questions? I can now talk a little bit about what you might do as the Seattle FOR or individually, some opportunities for some engagement. Lynn, you had a question? You're muted. Okay, I can hear you.
In terms of education in the prisons, I know that there are some, but has it ever been thought of to deal with every person, a criminal or anyone killing somebody? I mean, there's something that person has a mental disturbance. Has there been any attempt to, when the prisoners come in, to find out about them and to deal with their illness, and so that when they get out again, they will not be this sick criminal again?
Yeah, thank you that's a good question, but I assume that if you looked at what the Department of Corrections would say, they would say, yes, we do an evaluation of everybody coming in, some mental assessment. My experience just walking around in the prisons, you could even see that number of the prisoners are limited in some way just by looking at them. Often they're caught because they're not clever enough to not get caught. So I would like to think they're helped, but I doubt that they get anywhere near sufficient help. In fact, the issue of mental illness to the extreme is that there's supposed to be special treatment for the criminally insane, they're called, people that are severely dangerous to themselves and others, that you put them in a cell in a prison with guards that aren't trained to deal with that kind of person. You have real problems, and that's often the problem, that the guards simply don't know enough about mental illness. So I know that it's always a concern. As I said, that the new head of the Department of Corrections, Cheryl Strange, is a trained mental health nurse, and hopefully more attention will be given to those folks. I thought another part of the question was about whether they get education. There's a direct line of whether guys inside can get some education and whether they recidivize, whether they go back in. We've had to struggle. We got a bill through a couple of years ago that the community colleges would be funded for prisoners to get education. I'm not quite sure where that is now. The Trump administration pulled the so-called Pell grants, which were used for education within the prisons. A lot of the prisoners get their own education among themselves. A movie that we're touting now in the state is what's it called? But anyway, it's a story of a young guy, gang a member out of Tacoma who has learned himself and now is a major educator within the prison. So there's a whole lot of that. Kathy and I were part of a book group in the prison before they closed all that down when one of the guards was killed, one of the female guards was killed. But these guys were really, really, really on top of an educational process. They read books, they thought about things, they went to the law library. Education for many of them, we went to graduation of what behind bars or anyway, there's an organization that supports education within the system. Adele, you're muted.
Are you familiar with the Black Prisoners Caucus?
Oh yes, yeah, they do a lot of
Right.
education. Yeah,
Yes.
have any of you been in Monroe to a Black prisoner caucus or any opportunity for that kind of a visitation?
At Clallam Bay.
At Clallam Bay, okay, good for you. That's way up there. You had to travel to get there too. So
Sure did.
yeah.
On a snowy day.
On a
I
snowy
was
day.
glad to have a volunteer driver.
Well, these
Several of
caucuses,
us.
they have a day, and I've been into 2 or 3 of them where they have the public come in, legislators come in, and they make a presentation. The Black prisoners have a very formal program of what they've been doing to improve themselves, and they're quite articulate and impressive at what they've been able to accomplish, coming from often very little education to the point where they stand there and they're so articulate, and you of course sit there and say, whoa, why is this guy inside? Why isn't he outside? He's got so much to offer. Come on, out he goes. Doesn't work like that. About that time that I thought that, an older woman came to the front, African-American woman, and turned to the guys and said, I'm really impressed with what you've been able to do. You've done some marvelous things, even while you're in prison. But she said, I want to speak for the families who you've destroyed with the murders that you've committed,
Yeah.
the crimes that you've committed. And said, whatever you do, you can talk about how you've done all these wonderful things, but do it with humility. And she did it much more eloquently than I am. But there's that too.
Of course.
Did you have your hand up, Jean? I can't remember.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, the program I volunteer with is the one that Tom mentioned earlier, Alternatives to Violence Project.
Yes.
And mostly I've worked at a unit in Monroe where most of the people are sex offenders. They've done horrible things. So I wanted to say a large proportion of the prisoners have been abused as children themselves, physically and sexually. I mean, it's a horrible situation. And in that particular prison, they have a victim awareness program, and that is voluntarily. The prisoners can't be forced to go through it. And I always thought if somebody is an adult and they have no empathy, no compassion for other people, that there's just something wrong with them, that's not something, if you haven't learned it by the time you're an adult, that's it. But I learned something different from working with the prisoners and seeing, especially the ones that were going through the victim awareness program, they actually could, as adults, become compassionate people. And I saw how much they suffer when they're going through that program. They're really hurting. And when they start being able to understand the harm that they've done, and most of them just drop out of the program that I'm in for months at a time. And then a lot of them come back after they're finished with that program. And it's really something. It really it really gives me a lot of hope that there can be rehabilitation, that some of the people that you might just write off as just horrible people, throw away the key, really can become compassionate people with empathy.
Thank you. Yeah. We have a bias, public bias, and an institutional bias within the Department of Corrections that most of these men are not going to be able to be rehabilitated. Really, the court system send people in for life. The numbers of people in for life without parole. I don't know how many we have in the state, but there are numbers of them. The assumption is that when you put somebody in for life, they're incorrigible. There's no hope that anything can happen redemptive for these people, which is wrong. Straight out wrong. You're not the same person at 42 as you were at 18, and certainly not the same person at 62 as you were at 22. We don't allow for that. Adele?
What sort of treatment is used for the rehab that is most successful?
Well, one of the treatments for the sex offender that I watched is nobody wants to face somebody who's raped them. They don't, you can't do a restorative, I don't think, and I wouldn't want to ever be part of it, actually, of having to face somebody that raped you. But they will have somebody come in who was raped by somebody else, and they can turn their back to the person, the offender, and they can have a conversation. What was it like to be raped? What was the trauma like? What have you had to do to recover from the rape? And I suppose you could do that in other circumstances. Those of you who are more familiar with treatment would have other examples, but the restorative part is exactly what Jean's talking about. Can you get people to feel enough empathy? Can you get them to feel remorse? Can you get them to genuinely want to offer restitution for the harm they did? That's the basic 1, 2, 3s for all I'm concerned, for what would amount to treatment, effective treatment. Others of you have any comments on that, Kathy, or somebody that maybe knows a lot more about these things than I do in that regard? Anyway, so I don't know how much longer you want to go, but I want to make a couple of suggestions. One way to get engaged in the criminal justice system is the local prison, the local jail, I mean. Jail visitors, just to come in and accompany them, to listen, maybe to put a program together, maybe to do some educational work, but to be a companion inside, just in the jail system. The guys in jail tend not to be there very long. They're there for a year. They're often there longer if they're not sentenced and they haven't adjudicated out, so that they don't know where they're going. But any accompaniment in the local jails. If you know me at all, you know that my mantra is relationship, relationship, relationship. And the relationship in this case begins by befriending yourself with the people who are running the prison or running the jail. Get to know them. This is my experience. I have some training. I've done some work in the past. I have a real sense that this is something I could do and do well. How can I be used here? And how can I help you? That's where we begin. And then people, often there's Bible study. People in the religious community bring Bible studies in. Right now with COVID, you aren't going to get in. But that's one thing. The other is to join some of these coalitions. Our restorative justice, or our Quaker Voice work is mostly Quakers, but we would love to have somebody come in if you're interested in legislative work. We have 3 or 4 bills that we glom onto at the beginning of a session and follow through with it all through the session. This year, it was solitary confinement, a bill that maintained a minimum of restitution payments without the 12% interest that they had a couple years ago for any money that you owe, kind of thing. And what was the other one? I can't think of it just a second, but I've put my full time into the solitary confinement bill, which didn't pass, by the way. Very, very, very disappointed. I thought it would go through. So there's that. The AVP program that Jean talks about is something Kathy's did way early on, what, 30 years ago, Kathy? But going into a prison, doing a 3-day residency, actually. You go in the morning, come out in the afternoon, evening, go back in the next morning, come back out, go back in 3rd day. So you really get to know these guys, and you go through a process of what seem like games, but what you do is develop a rapport with these folks. They tell you stories, and they begin to trust. You play games where there's physical contact, and there's a lot of laughter, and they begin to say, well, there is an alternative violence, which is what the AVP program. It was founded by the Quakers in response to Attica. They were invited in to come in to do something besides beat the guys up, continue to beat the guys up who caused the outrage or the big fuss a number of years ago. And it's very successful, still used. Roger Cluck, some of you may know, is the facilitator, the organizer here in the King County or the Western Washington area. Great guy.
I have a question, and that's, we've talked about all the prisoners being guys. What kinds of programs are there for the women, say at Purdy? And do you feel like there is organizing to meet the needs of women prisoners?
I hear a lot of people, I hear a lot more about people having gone into work with the women at Purdy and elsewhere. I keep using the word guys because I've not been into the women's prisons, but there was a film recently on here in Washington. I can't remember the name of it now, but it was about a woman and her struggles with what it was like to go in. They followed her. She got out, she used again, goes back in. But that's kind of the story. But most of these women have been abused or have been assaulted in some way. So they come in with a terrible trauma history. I once was asked to do it was actually a Christmas Day session for the women in the prison in Maine, just to be in there for prayers. Because at that point I was single, and it was a sad scene. These people missed their families terribly, their children. It's a hard row for women, I think, even harder. One of the guys in Maine, the head of the middle correction facility, went to a seminar on women in prison. And I saw him shortly after. He said, I had no idea the difference between what it's like for a woman to be in prison and a man. And he didn't go into a whole lot of detail, but that's the kind of education that this is now 15, 20 years ago. So hopefully some progress has been made in dealing with women, incarcerated women, differently than for men.
I just saw that Jonathan put an article that was in Real Change newspaper in the chat. People might want to check that out.
Okay.
I think I have read that. It's been a little while, but yeah, I found that because women have the major responsibility for childcare,
Yeah.
that the third, the effects on children also, are there any programs at all to help the children of prisoners?
Oh, I'm sure there are. I don't know exactly what they are, but the numbers of children affected by incarcerated parents is in the hundreds of thousands. And it's very traumatic for them, especially they drag them in for visitations and, when's dad going to get out? And then they go back in if they recidivize. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know.
I have seen on World Channel some really good documentaries about the relationships between children and incarcerated parents.
Mm.
Beautiful documentaries. And people may not know about this, but it's World Channel is a free channel. It's like channel 9.1 is KCTS 9, and World Channel is 9.4, and independent documentaries. But in any case, that's where I have seen some wonderful documentaries about, children of incarcerated people, and staying with several of them, going through the process of visiting, and then of what their home life is like and so forth.
Yeah.
And they're tough, but they're great, a great education.
So Tom, did you say that you have no visitation now at Monroe because of COVID?
I hadn't been going in for 2 or 3 years, but now you can't go in at all. I suppose there are exceptions, bereavements, but one of the groups that I work with are made up mostly of families and loved ones of the incarcerated, and they're distraught. I don't know what a stronger word is by the whole situation. They have phone calls that are limited and very expensive, but I don't think they've had even non-contact visits. I don't know that for sure, but I've never heard of anybody having contact visits.
Why are the telephone calls so expensive?
Their claim is that they have to monitor them, especially difficult to monitor them because of drug deals and criminal behavior that can go on. So they have to put special monitorings on them. My answer is it's been one of the worst things I can imagine if I were a family member. But the reason is they're making money off of it. Somebody's making money. The prisons themselves were getting a cut of the costs, at least in Maine. I have not looked into it here, but that's just cruel to not allow them to have access. Brenda?
I understand that in addition to the prison making money out of it, that the phone companies charge more for those phone calls than they do.
Oh yeah.
So everybody all around
Yep.
makes money off the prisoners.
Yep, exactly. But I tried to bring that up a number of years ago in Maine, and they just kind of laughed it off. Well, we'll look into it. They never did, of course.
There's a group called Color of Change. Some of you may be familiar with. They have a phone justice project.
Uh-huh.
I don't know. I'll see if I can put something about that in the chat. I'm not sure I can find it quickly.
Mm-hmm. I think that is kind of all the things that I can mention. Of course, what I'm asking you to do is to hopefully giving you a little bit of a context to pay attention to the news, and if you're led to write letters or make phone calls, I'd love to see all of you on our Quaker Voice action list so that we can let you know when there's action. We put those out carefully. We don't get a lot of them out, but it's very helpful to have to let the legislators know that there is a deeper, wider, more informed concern about these issues, whatever the issue is. And we're always surprised at how few calls they get and how important, knowledgeable, informed calls can be.
I would like to be on that list, and I would like to share that
Okay.
for absolutely no contribution, you too can subscribe to the Tom's Saturday Evening Post, which I am finding very insightful.
I should probably put that up on my list here too. Thank you, Mary Margaret. I always like to end with something as positive as I can. I called my Saturday Evening Post an effort to offer a lift after I start with my prophetic vision of all the things that may be wrong. And the lift today is for those of us who've been working on torture issues, which are several of you. This was yesterday's one of the headlines, the opinion in the Washington Post. As clear as they could possibly be, solitary confinement is
Can't
torture.
read it. Could you read it?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'd never know whether things are upside down. When you see them, you don't see them upside down, do you?
No, it's just that I can't read it.
Okay. It says opinion, solitary confinement, what it is, torture, capital T. That's a whole other issue. We consider solitary confinement actually by international law, by the Mandela laws. Anybody that's held more than 15 consecutive days is committing an international crime according to Mandela laws. So beyond that is torture. And that
What can you say about that practice in Washington state prisons?
solitary confinement, right now it has absolutely no restrictions. They are totally administratively controlled. The legislation that we almost passed this year, we got through the House, we got it through, if you know the process, we got it through rules, which is the next step before it goes to the floor for a vote. And they ran the timeout on it. But this would have provided a number of legislative restrictions on the use of solitary confinement. No more than 15 days consecutive and no more than, I don't know, number of days total year. So they don't let you out for a day and then put you right back in kind of things. But mostly we were interested in having attention given to guys put in there, that when they go in, we really wanted them to get a medical evaluation, because many of these guys going in are already in bad state emotionally or mentally, depressed, or in some way mentally off. To evaluate them, they often put people in solitary to do suicide watches on them, for example. We were interested in that. We were interested in, I think, I don't know exactly how we worded it, but the idea is that instead of they need a reason to let them out, they need to have a reason to keep them in. So they would need to document. We want a lot more data on why these people are put in there. Not trying to say you can only stay in there 15 days, but why'd you put them in there in the first place? That kind of regulation. I think we'll get it next year. We got very close. We had some strong support this year, but the coalition that was supporting this the day after were just so sad. I had to use my limited pastoral skills to give people something to hope for. And they were just, because these are people, many of whom have loved ones in there, and they're now going to be in longer. They're going to be subject to this non-accountable treatment of people in solitary. And that drives them crazy, and they can't even go and see them. Oh. Well, Bert. You're muted in case you're ready to talk.
Sorry, I should know that by now. I wanted to try and add something positive, and it may sound strange at first, but I think it's very positive, I think, from my perspective. There's one person I would like to put in jail, consensus, and throw the key away. And I'm getting better at that, because I agree very much with Kazu Haga, who says, if you aren't working for beloved community, if there's anyone you exclude from beloved community, you're not doing non-violence in the deepest way. You're not doing what you said right at the beginning, Tom, which is relationship, 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 healing the relationships. So I'm consciously working about Dick Cheney. My desire is not to have Dick Cheney put in jail and treated badly. And well, I'll never be in a position to affect Dick Cheney personally, I don't believe. Still, that inner wish that I have cultivated for years is getting less. And I think that's a sign of progress for me. So anyone that wants to take that seriously with their nemesis, with their person who doesn't deserve good treatment, because that's exactly the same mental state as the people who want to throw the keys away and put people in jail forever have with their concepts of whoever is doing bad.
Thanks, Bert. You're always an inspiration in that way.
Oh. Well, I'm trying. I'd like to recommend the book then, Kazu Haga's book.
Oh, yeah.
Healing Resistance, because that title itself is so great.
Yeah, great book.
You resist and you heal at the same time. That's really good nonviolence.
Did I speak to your condition here? Did I answer anything or pick any curiosities, or did you find most of what I said already known to you? I don't know. A little help of feedback would be appreciated.
I am making a commitment to do something.
I love you, Mary Margaret. You're just, oh, yes.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. We really appreciate this program. And for all of you, you can go to the chat and get the books. You can get Tom's address right off it's Tom Ewell Connections.org.
Yeah.
And you can get in touch with Tom and get on the alert lists for, I'm sure that Brenda and Jean can include some of the alerts in the communiques that they do to our membership. But if you would like more frequent opportunities to contact appropriate authorities, I would say contact Tom and have him add you to those lists that have more frequent alerts and other ideas.
Yeah, the Tom Ewell Connections is my blog. My email was up before. It's TEWELL, looks like tool @whidbey.com.
Okay.
And I'd love to hear from you and encourage you. And I always appreciate the opportunity to talk about prisons and criminal justice, and especially the people that, like you, who really do care about these issues and are committed to doing what you can.
Thanks so much. Thanks to everyone for being here tonight, and we'll see you next month, March 20th.